Alright guys, welcome back. I'm making this tutorial specifically dedicated just to collisions and overlaps. And the reason for that is I've seen so many questions about it on the Answer Hub that it's crazy. And 90% of you guys are just using them completely wrong. You know, I go in there to answer a question about it, to tell you what to hook up to what, and I just look at things, and stuff like isn't even hooked up right. You know, it's not even a question about did you have the right type of collision on, was physics enabled, was hit events enabled, things like that. I mean, you guys are just messing this up pretty bad. So I thought the best way to tackle this, instead of me answering 30 questions the same way, I'm just going to make a tutorial about it, and you guys can watch this and hopefully it'll help clear up a lot of these issues. And guys, I've been where you are. I don't know any coding. I'm not a computer programmer or anything. I picked this stuff all up from watching YouTube tutorials and reading, so I get it. And that's why I think this tutorial is really going to help you guys out, because I'm going to go over in nitty-gritty detail all of this stuff about overlaps and what boxes to check and which ones to avoid. Alright, so let's get to it. First thing we have here, I made two blueprints. One is a player character. It's very basic. I mean, I have some extra stuff in here, but that's just from doing other tutorials and helping other people out. And I have a test cube that I'm putting into my world that we're going to be running into and trying to trigger these overlap events. So the important things to remember here, this cube, it literally looks like a cube, just a little brick here. But what I want to show you guys, if you click on the cube here and you scroll down in this details panel over here on the right to collision, I have checked here generate overlap events, and this we're going to make a physics actor, and that's going to preset a whole bunch of like all of this collision and the object type. Okay, so we're starting with a physics actor here. Compile this and save. And in our player character, one of the things that's tricky is that as you add more components, you have to keep track of what the collision properties are on each one of these components, because right here we have three different things that can have separate collisions. So we have the capsule component, and as you see here, this collision preset is pawn. So everything is grayed out, we can't fix anything, it's just preset to a pawn, and the object type is pawn. We have a mesh, which I'm not actually using. There's no skeletal mesh in this. We are literally just going to be this little sphere, very simple. But this is set to character mesh, but if you notice, the object type is also pawn. So it has the same collision properties as the capsule component that was set to pawn right here. And finally we have the sphere. This I just threw in here from add component, sphere, and that's what comes up. And I have set these collision properties to pawn, and you see the object type is already defaulted to pawn with the same kinds of collision properties. So this is where we're starting out. Now, what I want to do is get a overlap event for this sphere. And I'm going to use the sphere as opposed to anything else on here, because if you see in our viewport, this edge of the sphere is actually further out than the capsule. So this is what's going to interact with the world before it gets anywhere near this capsule. And that's why people can have a lot of problems. You know, your capsule may be set up right, but then you have a mesh like this that's set up to block everything, and you're not getting overlap events because they're actually not hitting the capsule at all. They're hitting your mesh. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to click on this sphere, right? And over here in the details panel, we're going to scroll all the way to the bottom and see these events. The second one down is on component begin overlap. This is the one that we're going to play around with. So we're going to hit plus, and it's going to automatically add that to our editor. Now, what I want you guys to do is off of this, drag and say print. So we're going to have one print string. Now, you can click on this, Control C, Control V, and Control V. Now, we're going to hook all three of these up together, like so. And this middle one, I'm going to say overlaps. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Now, off of this thing, I want it to actually show us what, first of all, it's going to say what's overlapping what. That's what we're going to build right here. So this other actor, I've seen some people not hook anything up, like they'll just leave it like this. And let me show you exactly what that is doing. So if we drag from the other actor pin, go all the way to the final print string, you see it's going to automatically convert into get display name, and that's what's going to be printed to the computer screen. So we'll be able to see which actor is overlapping our sphere. Now, I want to do the same thing for the sphere. So it'll say sphere overlaps and then whatever. So I'm just going to click on this, Control C, Control V, and hook this up to the first print string. And now I'm going to get a reference to self. So if you right click in the viewport or in this editor and type in self, it'll say get reference to self, hit enter, and it'll automatically make the connection. So this is actually going to tell us, it's going to print out player character, because that's what this blueprint is. Self is a player character. So when something overlaps, what this is going to do is say player character, print to the screen, overlaps, and then whatever we overlapped. Alright, now I'm going to do the exact same thing in the other blueprint. So I'm just going to highlight all of this, Control C, compile this, save, and go into our test cube, go into the event graph here, and I'm just going to paste this right down here, Control V. Now, this overlap event is for the sphere. As you can tell, it says sphere here, but we have a cube, so I'm going to have to delete this, and I'm going to click on our cube, and I'm going to do the exact same thing. Scroll all the way down to events, get onComponent begin overlap right here, click on it, and there we go. And I'm going to hook this one up to the print string. And this is going to do the same thing. So it's going to get a reference to yourself, which is test cube, and it's going to print that anytime something overlaps the cube. Then it's going to say test cube overlaps, and then whatever we're overlapping. So this other actor here, I'm going to drag in to get display name. So now that we have this set up, I'm going to compile and save, and we'll see what happens. So we're going to hit play now. So this little sphere, that's us. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run into these test cubes over here. Now you see they're physics actors, so they're actually moving and rolling around when I hit them. But nothing is printing to the screen. Alright, let's fix that. The reason nothing is happening is because if we look, our player character, the sphere that we're trying to trigger an overlap event with, its default settings are pawn, which means it blocks everything. And if we look at our test cube here, its default settings, let me bring this out, is block everything. So both of these actors are blocking each other. But if you notice, generate overlap events is checked. So this alone does not actually generate an overlap event. Even when we're not checking to see what's overlapping what, this should be printing if anything overlaps anything. But nothing's happening because they're both set to block here in the collision everything. So what I'm going to do is change this from physics actor to custom. And if you'll notice, the only thing that actually changed when I did this is it just opened all of this up for me to mess around with. So I'm going to compile and save. And I'm going to do the same thing over here in the player character to sphere. I'm going to set this to custom. Now you see it still says object type is pawn, and everything is still set up the same way as the pawn. Alright? But now we can mess around and do things. So the cube was a physics actor, right? So right here it says physics body. Now if you look at the test cube, the object type of the test cube is a physics body. You can change this to whatever you want in here, but right now it's set to be a physics body. When you click this custom, the collision presets, any collision preset, for example when we had physics actor, it automatically locks you into a specific object type and a specific set of collision properties. So when I went to custom, it kept the object type and the collision properties, but now I can edit all of this stuff in here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to leave this one here. I'm going to compile. This is a physics body, remember that. Now I'm going to go to the player character, and our sphere, what I'm going to do is tell it can overlap physics bodies. So I'm going to check this box, overlap, and I'm going to hit compile and save, and now we're going to test this out. So now let's see what happens when I roll into this. Do you see that? It's now printing a whole bunch of stuff to the screen. Now, I'm going to stop and I'm going to play it again. But this time I'm going to go very slowly, so hopefully only one event triggers. There. Alright, now I'm going to hit the tilde button, which is right next to the number 1 on your keyboard. It's that little squiggly line next to it to the left. And that'll bring up what happened, the print strings, so we can spend time talking about this. So now you see it says player character overlaps test cube. Now if we look in our player character, that's exactly what this is. When this happens, now we're getting an overlap event, and it's printing to the screen self. Player character, print that, overlaps, and then what actor overlapped it? Test cube. Great. So that's working for the player character. But if you notice, right after that it says test cube overlaps player character. Well, that is the execution for it here in the test cube, right? So when the test cube overlaps something, it's going to say test cube overlaps player character, because now the player character is also overlapping the test cube. The reason this is happening is because even though the cube is set to block, right here, the collision presets, it's set to block pawn, which is what the player character is. So this shouldn't fire, right? Well, because the player character can actually overlap the physics actor, this ends up firing anyway, even though it's set to block. This is exactly why you need to hook things up to this. Let me stop simulating for a minute. This is why you need to hook things up to this other actor, because if you don't, it can ignore all of your collision presets, it can overlap with anything, it can overlap with, the ground, if you don't have anything checking what this actor is before you start firing off your execution pins. Okay, so how can we improve this? If we go back into our player character, and now we want to test against the test cube, for example, right? So if we drag off of this and say cast to test cube, so now we have the test cube. So this is going to check if this actor is a test cube. So what we want to do is put this before we start doing anything. So I'm going to move all of this down. We'll move this right here. And then if it is a test cube, that's what this one is. This is true. It's going to print the same thing to the screen. But if it's not a test cube, down here, off of this I'm going to pull and say print, and then we'll say not a test cube. So compile and save this. Now, what I'm going to do is duplicate the test cube by right-clicking here and click duplicate. So we will say this will be failed test cube. Now what I'm going to do in the failed test cube is I'm going to change its collision settings. So I'm going to go to the cube and I'm going to scroll down to collision. And what I'm going to do with this, I don't want this sphere to be able to overlap. So right now it overlaps physics bodies. So I'm going to make sure this is anything but a physics body, like world static. Okay? And then I'm going to compile and save. And in the viewport, I'm going to get rid of this material just so we can kind of tell the difference between them. I'm going to clear it out, compile, and save. And now I'm going to drag one of these into the world. Okay, so when I hit this one, nothing should happen. But when I hit these, we should get what we got before on the screen. Alright, so let's see what happens. Here we are. We're going to run into this thing. Nothing happens, I'm just moving it. But now let me run into this, and you see we we've printed now to the screen. Player overlaps test cube, and test cube is overlapping the player. I did that by hitting tilde again, which is the squiggly line next to the 1 if you guys forgot. And if you hit tilde, it'll go away. So now let's see this again. When I hit this gray cube, nothing happens. When I hit this cube, we get the overlap. And notice, this isn't even printing that it failed. And the reason for that is because it can't overlap. So let's exit out of here and go and see this in the player character again. So what's happening here is it's testing if it can overlap, taking this actor and seeing, is it a test cube? Well, the answer to that is no, so it should be able to come down here, right? The problem is it can't even run this part. It's not even recognizing that it overlaps something because the collision presets for the failed test cube aren't compatible with what the sphere can overlap. Remember, we set the failed test cube here. Collision is world static. Now, if I go in the player character to the sphere and say it can overlap world static by checking this box, and now I compile, it should print this out for us. So let's hit play. Alright, now I'm going to run into that cube. Now, do you see that? So let's hit tilde again. It says not a test cube. Failed test cube overlaps player character. So now it's printing out this thing. The not a test cube, if we look back at the player, that's what it should print out when the player overlaps the failed test cube, right? But if we look at the failed test cube, now that those two can overlap, the failed test cube is also printing out the same thing that we had from the good test cube. So it's going and saying failed test cube overlaps player character. So those are the two things that we're seeing here. This first line is the player character, and the second line is the overlap of the cube on the player character. So again, player character on cube is the first line, cube on player character is the second line. Okay, let's get out of that. Now, let's see what else we can do with this. So what happens if I go into the test cube and I allow the test cube to overlap pawns? So remember, it was firing already when the player character ran into it. This executed, as well as when the player overlapped the test. So it was going both ways, right? But what happened was you were still moving the cube. So in case you guys missed that here, let me put this back. We're going to have this block everything, right? And the player character is going to be able to overlap. I'm going to put this back too. It's going to overlap the physics body, which is what the good test cube is, the regular test cube. And let's play. Now I'm going to run into the regular test cube, and you see it moves. It triggers the overlap, but it moves. Now, watch what happens when I take this test cube and I give it overlap settings with the player. So the player is the pawn, right? Now, the test cube is going to overlap the player, and the player also overlaps the test cube. So the only thing I changed there was the test cube's overlap. It will now overlap pawns. Now watch what happens when I run into it. I went right through. It still triggered the overlap events, but I went straight through the cube. So this is because both of these things now are overlapping each other. And that's how you get this effect. When only one of them was allowed to overlap, you got the overlap trigger on both, but it acted more like a physics body where I was able to push it around. Kind of like this one. See? Because this one won't let me overlap it. And it's not even triggering that it's a failed cube because I got rid of that ability. My pawn does not overlap world static objects anymore. But if I go to one of these, I run right through it. Now, another thing that I've seen is that because there's so many things in the player or in people's blueprints, so many components, you'll see that one is probably not the same collision as the other one. So watch what happens if I take the capsule component And remember, our test cube, I'll show you here again, test cube is overlapping pawns. But what happens if I leave the sphere? Remember, we could run through it now because they both overlap each other. But I'm going to change the capsule component. So instead of this being a pawn preset with everything to block, I'm going to put this to custom. Everything is still blocked. But what I'm going to do is, instead of allowing this to overlap the physics bodies, instead of allowing the test cube, remember the test cube can overlap pawns, and this player character capsule component is a pawn. So even though it's set to block everything, the test cube will let it run through. Watch what happens if I set this to be a world dynamic and compile. So now the test cube is set to block world dynamic. We'll see what happens. Play. Now I run into this thing, pushes it around. If I run into the other cube, get this one, now I'm pushing this one. It's still triggering the overlap event, but I'm pushing it now. And the reason for that is, it's not the sphere that's pushing it now, it's the capsule component. It's not allowing me to run through this cube anymore. Now watch, if I go back out and go to the player character to the capsule component and change this from world dynamic to pawn again and compile, you will see that I can run through it again. There you go. And now, if that's not confusing enough, if I leave this capsule component here in the player character as a world dynamic, compile it, and put the test cube here to allow it to overlap world dynamic as well as pawn, can you guys guess what it's going to do? Let's see. Let's see if you're right. Exactly. Went right through it, because now we are overlapping both types of components that are contained in the player character. Alright guys, I think that's good enough for today. Hopefully this helps you guys out a lot with collisions and things to look for. Yeah, so hopefully you won't have as many questions. Alright guys, see you later.